All right, we're at the top of the hour, so we'll get it kicked off. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. This is the first of our four-part Copilot webinar series. We are recording this event, so participation indicates consent, and we will be sharing the recording out with you guys after the event and the follow-up emails. We're excited to be here today and talk with you guys about AI and the modern workplace. Without further ado, I want to remind you that the chat and the Q&A are both open. So please feel free to enter any questions you have throughout the presentation. We'll save time at the end of the session to talk about those questions that are submitted. So please feel free to pop those in there throughout, and Caitlin and Timothy would be happy to answer them after the event. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Caitlin and Timothy.
Awesome. Thank you, Rachel. Yep. As you mentioned, I'm Tim Evans. I am an adoption change management consultant, and I'm joined here by Caitlin on our webinar today.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. Like Tim, I'm also an adoption change management consultant, and we've been working really excitedly in the Copilot space for a little while now. So we're really excited for you to join us to talk a little bit more about how you can get started with AI in your workplace.
Awesome. So let's go ahead and take a look at our agenda. So first, we're going to go through a brief history of AI and the history of Copilot. We'll then look at why now is exactly the time to embrace AI in the workplace. We'll then go through the various Copilots that Microsoft offers. We'll look at a quick demo, and then, like Rachel mentioned, we'll answer questions. We've saved time at the end for questions, but if you do have questions throughout our webinar today, feel free to either drop them in the chat or the Q&A. We'll kind of monitor that as we go, but like I mentioned, we do have kind of dedicated time at the end to answer questions. And then just a reminder here that this webinar is the first in our series of webinars about Copilot, and we do have some awesome topics coming up. So we have information security and protection, maybe perfect for IT and compliance folks within your organization. We then also have enabling Microsoft 365 Copilot adoption, talking about driving usage and generating excitement around the tool. You may also see some familiar faces leading that webinar. And then finally, last but not least, extending Microsoft Copilot. So thinking about growing Copilot for Microsoft 365 beyond current applications with graph connectors and plugins. So do be sure to register for those webinars. I'm going to leave them up for just a moment here. We have QR codes down at the bottom, but we do also have QR codes towards the end of our webinar. So just in case you don't have time, you can register at the end of our session today. So I'll leave it up for just a moment here if you want to grab your phone. Use our fancy QR codes. Before we actually get into our agenda for today, I wanted to take a moment to introduce exactly who we are. So we are Valorum Reply, a Microsoft-focused consultancy that really prides itself on delivering exceptional modern work tools, security, and Azure services. We're particularly focused on the Microsoft stack, but we're actually a part of the larger Reply group with over 200 specialized consultancies really across the globe, and each having their own specialization on a particular technology. But at Valorum Reply, because we have such a close partnership with Microsoft, we've been lucky enough to be a part of the early access and jumpstart programs for Copilot, and we're actually qualified to deliver the Microsoft-funded Copilot for M365 workshop. So as you'll see across all these different webinars, we're total geeks about Copilot. We're really excited, and yeah, we love talking Copilot. So I'm going to go ahead and, yep, I think hand it over to Caitlin here to really kick off our agenda.
Great. Thank you so much, Tim. Before we jump right on into Copilot specifically, I do want to talk through a little bit of the history of AI, but instead of just sort of talking through it, I want to show how Copilot can help streamline this research process. So instead of doing manual research to come up with this information and this rich history, I can turn to my generative AI assistant, Copilot. So in this instance, I'll leverage Copilot for the web on my browser. I like to turn the conversation style to more creative because I tend to like the way it responds, especially in what I'm looking to achieve. As a sort of adoption change management consultant, I'm drafting a lot of engaging material. So I love this creative option. But I want to make sure that I can make a slide about the history of AI. As I write out my prompt, I give Copilot a little bit of context on who I am and why I'm looking for this information. I also tell Copilot my expectations or maybe how I want it to respond, right? So I explain that I'm a technical consultant. I'm looking to create really engaging content on the history of AI, and I wanted to provide a brief history that is engaging and that lists specific sources. So I'm looking for machine learning developments. I'm looking for scientists. I'm looking for really big sort of booms in the AI sphere. And when it looks through the web, what it's going to do is it's going to crawl publicly facing information. So essentially, instead of going to, Bing.com and doing all of this research myself, instead of clicking through links and having all of those purple links behind me, Copilot is fetching that information for me, which is really, really great. And as we can see here, it's already starting to give me a really great list of sources. It's following my instructions. I love some of the titles that it's given. That's why I always switch it to the more creative option there. And I can see that it's listing out exactly what I asked. So it's listing out certain scientists. It's listing out certain sort of big booms or machines that were created. It's breaking it down into sort of eras, and it's really, really nice. So from here, what I can do is I can copy and paste the text to bring it into the presentation, which then looks a little something like this. And one thing that I do want to highlight when I go to leverage Copilot as my assistant to help me with this research is that it's really helping me generate this draft. So it's eliminating the sense of where do I even begin? How do I display this information and put it in a succinct way? I can absolutely leave the contents like this, but I like to add a little bit of color and design. So I go to Designer within PowerPoint, which then turns this into this slide. So there we have it. My research was done in a matter of minutes. And what I like about this specific example is that on our first webinar series talking about the history of AI, I did all the research myself in the very classic method. And I can tell you right now that using Copilot saved a few hours of time, and the information is presented in a more concise and more engaging way. And then by giving me some time back, I was able to be more productive, and I tackled a backlog of activities on my to-do list. So love being able to showcase how Copilot can work right at the top here. But to actually talk about the history that Copilot wrote out for me, as we can see, AI starts really in the early 20th century, laying the groundwork for machine learning. So you talk about Alan Turing, starting in the 1950s. And then we move on to some of those early AI programs that use natural language, like ELIZA. They started really showcasing what was possible. And of course, I mean, many of us may remember when IBM's Deep Blue won that chess game. I certainly do. My whole family was around. So to think about these sort of large, developments within AI happening over the span of half a century, it's often really easy to think of AI as a new technology, but really what it's done is it's built upon all of this work from the early 20th century till now. And now we're moving from beyond just machines understanding patterns and behaviors to generating new ones. So that's really impressive. And that's what sort of turns this conversation on AI into generative AI. And what's so fascinating and what feels so transformational about generative AI is that it creates new content based on a prompt or a query. So it's taking those underlying large language models, which have been trained on billions of words, to identify things like patterns and structures within existing data to then, again, create new and original content. It's leveraging everything it's trained on. So it's understanding your tone, your sentiment, your question by using the syntax and the neural networks from the AI models that we saw on the previous slide from the history. It takes your prompt and breaks it into patterns, or sometimes what we call tokens, and then returns content based on what it found in relation to those tokens. So the models are combing through all of the information fed to it to create an output that makes sense. And what makes this so exciting, really, is that if you give a generative AI tool the same prompt over and over, chances are the results will actually always be a little bit different because it's constantly going to the models and constantly searching for information to feed you a response. So again, that's where that new and original content is coming from, which is all super very exciting. And I love talking about generative AI, but I'm going to pass it back over to Tim to talk a little bit more about why you would want to bring it into the modern workplace.
Yeah, let me just make sure I'm off mute there. Yeah, it's definitely exciting, right? And of course, as you're sitting there, you might really be wondering how exactly does what Caitlin talked about fit into your organization? How does it fit into what you and maybe your team members are doing every single day? So if we look at some numbers here, if we take a step back and really zoom in on how people are working today, we can see that people are really struggling for um, to be frank. And this is according to the 2023 Work Trend Index annual report. So we can see that 64% of employees are struggling to find a time to complete their work. And they're also experiencing 3 times the amount of calls and meetings that they had since February 2020. So stepping back, right, there's too much work and there's too much in the way of getting that work done. Now, when it comes to AI, 70% of people were saying that they do feel actually comfortable delegating tasks that they might have to AI to lighten their workload. And when we talk about leaders and surveying leaders, leaders are actually interested in AI to boost productivity rather than reducing headcount. So the story here being told is that using AI can really free up your employees to do the work that really matters, right? The work that brings passion to your teams, leads to all different types of innovations across industries, and hopefully pushes boundaries within your business. So where exactly, right, do your employees need help? Well, Microsoft has actually identified 3 key pillars that answers that question. And the first is the broken meeting. So people are, like we heard, in 3 times the amount of calls, and no one can be everywhere at once, right? I'm thinking of Hermione Granger and Harry Potter. Nobody has that ability to be everywhere at once. And then people are also finding it hard to pay attention and to grab comprehensive notes. And then finally, if you do happen to miss that meeting, it's really, really hard to catch up and find the information that you need on that meeting that you missed. And that segues us into the information labyrinth. So while there's so much information out there, it's really hard to find, right? Combos are happening in multiple different locations, and it's really just leading to confusion. And then lastly, what Caitlin was demoing when we talked about the history of AI is this idea that the blank page and the ability or maybe inability to find the time to be creative is really troubling employees at the moment right now. So these are the 3 pillars, right, where employees need help. And we have some slides here on where exactly Microsoft can answer those questions. So I'll hand it back over to Caitlin to go through that.
Awesome. Thank you, Tim. Yeah. So by identifying those pillars where Microsoft and some of the tools and technology can help, let's take a little bit closer look at the AI lineup available at Microsoft. So Copilot on its own is the name of Microsoft's generative AI tool. So on a personal level, you can access this through what used to be called Bing Chat. It's the AI-powered search and content generation. So then when you add in your organization's E3 or E5 license, you add in commercial data protection to the fold. So that ensures that your data and your interactions and your queries stay safe and are protected by a service boundary when leveraging Copilot on the web. And then on top of this sort of baseline foundation comes some of the other Copilots, including Copilot for Microsoft 365, which is going to bring in things like security and compliance, permissions, data, context, and of course, your M365 applications. But then further building on Copilot for Microsoft 365 are the Copilots for business functions, which are going to include sales, service, or finance. These are taking the Copilot for Microsoft 365 foundation and kind of leveling them up to bring in built-in, ready-to-go data integrations with tools like Dynamics 365, Salesforce, ServiceNow, or SAP. If we take a quick zoom in on Copilot for Microsoft 365, it's really a great tool for everyone. It's powered by OpenAI's GPT-4 large language model, in addition to the data, content, people, files, meetings, emails, and other information available in the Microsoft Graph, which is the data that you already have access to. Copilot then, of course, embeds into your applications and understands their function in order to be fit for purpose for that application. And then you can leverage the internet in addition to this content. So often when using graph-grounded chat with Copilot, you can turn on the web content plugin to really marry your internal content and external publicly facing content to round out the responses. If we want to look at it from 30,000 feet, this illustration shows how it's all really kind of working in the back end. So if you start in your applications in the upper left-hand corner, maybe in Word, you may ask Copilot to help you generate an FAQ document based on a certain file within Project Unicorn at your organization. So first, it's going to shoot the prompt to the graph and the semantic index for pre-processing or grounding. It's doing a lot of research to answer questions like, what is Project Unicorn? What is the organization? What's the context for this reference file? And who is requesting it? And what do they have access to? And also things like, what do you mean by FAQ doc? It translates all of this into a response for the large language model. So it's taking the data and the tokens that we all talked about, shooting it over to the large language model to help it understand the response and create that new and original content we talked about. But then after it creates that new and original content, it goes ahead and puts it back into the graph and that semantic index for post-processing. So making sure that then everything still aligns with the response. And then it gives it back to you, the requester, within the application in which you requested it. So it's pretty amazing stuff that tends to happen in about 30 seconds or less. And that is just the Copilot for Microsoft 365 experience. When we consider other Copilots, like the Copilots for sales, service, or finance, you can then access the power of that Microsoft Graph in addition to key data in your CRM system. So that way, information and data from both of those systems will inform the response. And what I really like about this visual is that it highlights one of Copilot's most valuable features. You are given one place to go for all of the vital information you need. Rather than starting a search in SharePoint or your internet and then searching through Teams and then trying to context switch into your CRM and try to manually compile all of the information you need, Copilot not only grabs it for you in one easy to access prompt pane, but then it can synthesize that information as well. So that's a lot of really great information on what Microsoft has to offer and kind of how it's working in the back end. But we can talk a little bit more about its value. I'll pass that back over to Tim.
Yeah, awesome. So thinking about value, thinking about like what are the practical uses, right? Identifying high value use case scenarios is going to be really key for your organization to understand the business value of Microsoft Copilot. So thinking about the things that we've covered, it can be kind of hard to understand the value of Copilot when we speak in general terms like time saved. So we really need to look at ways in which we can improve efficiencies across the board, looking specifically at those non-value add activities that are necessary, right? But really eat away at the day or the time in the day. Because really when you use a tool to improve efficiencies, we can look at things like cost reduction, like operational costs or additional tools that can be replaced. And then we can also look at revenue growth here. So how these improved efficiencies can mean increased revenue. On the next slide here, let's take a look at some hard numbers here. So of course, before we saw generative AI might be how it might be beneficial in your workplace, how we can think about its value. But now that Copilot for Microsoft 365 has been actually generally available, we do have hard numbers that directly report and showcase its value. So from an April 2024 study conducted by Forrester on the total economic impact of Copilot for Microsoft 365, they found that organizations leveraging Copilot can increase their top line revenues up to 4%. They can also decrease operational expenditures by 0.7%. And then finally, they can actually reduce onboarding time for new employees by up to 30%. And then beyond that, really, we think about unquantifiable benefits, right? Like better work-life balance for your employees, time saved, and then finally, improvements to diversity, equity, inclusion. So these are great numbers, but how exactly do we get to these numbers? And when we work with organizations, we're often asked who exactly should have Copilot, right? When clients want to maybe run a pilot program, sometimes they get stuck in the planning process, deciding who exactly gets to experience the tool as maybe a representative of their collective. And really the short answer is easy. The use cases for Copilot can be for everyone. There's no right or wrong group of pilot users in your organizations, but what's actually critical is understanding the value add and the impact across different business units. So whether you're a person in HR, you're in sales, you're in finance or IT, there's use cases here for absolutely everyone. And even in your own departments, we can think about different use cases for different personas and different types of roles within specific departments. And really, to tell the truth here, the use cases might actually surprise you. Some, of course, might seem obvious. An executive or administrative assistant might find value in Copilot during a Teams meeting, or a content creator might use Copilot to help liven up maybe a LinkedIn post, but other use cases really are almost counterintuitive. So when I think about my own Copilot use cases, I know Word and Excel might be my strengths, but I do really find myself struggling and my time gets eaten up by design aspects within PowerPoint and those kind of creative aspects of client work. So rather than steal the PowerPoints from Caitlin that she so wonderfully creates, I can actually use Copilot to assist me in making some clean and client-ready decks. And then on the flip side there, if someone doesn't specialize in Excel, they can create pivot tables and analyze their data and learn formulas that they might not have had access to before, or rather than combing through a bunch of different knowledge bases. So the idea here is that Copilot is for everyone. Because of its foundation in natural language and conversation, we can think about use cases across the board within your organization. And with that, we're going to get to the demo part of our section. So I'll hand it back over to Caitlin.
Yes, thank you, Tim. And I love that point about it being counterintuitive. I'll raise my hand as the person who does not know how to use Excel. So I absolutely love Copilot and Excel there. But let's go ahead and take a look at Copilot in action through some of what we like to call day in the life scenarios. So we like to look at these through the lens of how Copilot can really infiltrate your whole day. So for example, we can start with HR. The overarching work stream presented here is to hire a new employee, and we can see where Copilot can help across the various phases of the project. So if we break it down into some of the tasks, there's generating a job description. We've got to screen candidates. We have to prepare interview questions, conduct those interviews, and then, of course, draft an offer letter and create some new hire onboarding materials. We touch a lot of common M365 applications across these tasks, which means that there are a lot of opportunities to bring Copilot into your everyday work. I want to focus first on looking at this very first task of generating that job description. So when we open up Word, we can leverage Copilot to help us draft long form content. So you can either open up this prompt pane right here. We can see Copilot in the top ribbon, which would make it accessible on the side of our screen. But for this example, I'm looking to hire a senior front-end engineer with specific qualifications, like 5 years of experience and a technical degree. I had about 2,000 characters in the prompt pane, but I wanted to see how Copilot would respond just to get me started. And as we can see here, I actually quite like what it's done, right? It's taken everything that it's trained on to create a job description that matches kind of what is familiar. I can always refine it as I'm doing here. I added a benefit about adding 401k matching. I updated the email address that I want people to reach out to. And so it's regenerating that. And this is where I really want to touch on how Copilot's creating new content. Nothing about this draft is wildly different than the first one. It's added in my feedback and my refinement, but a couple of things are different to note, mainly that we're kind of missing bullet points, so the formatting is a little bit different. But that's a great testament to how Copilot is going to give you something a little bit new with each prompt. So now, as an HR employee, I've refined what I needed to refine on here, and I can keep the draft. I can review it, make sure there's any sort of specific company language in there, but then I can also have the engineering hiring manager take a look at it to ensure that everything around the job description is all right. But what we did in quite literally a matter of seconds could have taken anywhere from 30 minutes to 2 hours of my day before, kind of depending on all of the different reference material I had. So speaking to that blank page, getting everything started for me so then I can focus on really driving into my next tasks. But that was just an HR use case. Another frequent need we often see is for sales teams, and they often are having to create a pitch. And many times there's a really fine line between using materials that may already be in existence while making sure that the pitch is suited to the client. So in this particular use case, in this story, we need to start with discovery and maybe some collaborative note-taking in Loop, researching the customer and their needs online, finding notes and long threads in your email chains. And then we're talking about updating or creating a sales presentation, summarizing a presentation and a meeting in Teams, and finally creating that final proposal. So again, a lot of points here where we can bring Copilot in to help not only streamline these tasks, but spend less time and effort to close those sales. Speaking back to a little bit about Tim was discussing before about creating those efficiencies that help drive revenue growth. So we can spend less time working on this entire sales process to close this deal. We can work faster. We can drive that revenue growth overall. To showcase this, I want to talk about Copilot and PowerPoint to create that powerful presentation. It starts by leveraging your organization's template, and then I can ask Copilot to create a presentation on any topic. But here we see that I'm referencing a very specific file, which is something I love about Copilot and PowerPoint. It's taking an outline that I created in Word to then generate a presentation in the format and style that I want. So in this case, I was looking to make a presentation about SharePoint Online, why my client might benefit from a migration to SharePoint. PowerPoint's going to help me generate slides within the template that speak to the outline. And as we can see here, it has made about 15 slides for me. It's also noted the outline and sort of the key points. And not only has it created these slides within my template, it's also generated my speaker notes. So it's created specific notes for me, but then also leveraged the original content that was in the Word document so that I can kind of see, I can compare, I can edit on from there. And in general, I think this looks great. I may continue to pull up Designer, refine the look and feel, but again, I've spent so much less time now preparing and getting that sort of blank page out of the way. And now I've got a lot more time to spend time making an impactful presentation that's going to be really suited to the client, that's going to really help me win that work. And then one of my favorite use cases, project management. There are so many scenarios in which a project manager can leverage Copilot. The task at large that we're talking about here is creating a project plan, and to break it into subtasks like any good project manager, we do need to understand and summarize the information we have to build a framework. We need to hold meetings with team members and identify action items. We need to brainstorm, coordinate updates, and communicate across channels, create presentations, and document support procedures. And as many project managers know, working with teammates across departments and functional business units can feel a little bit like herding cats at the best of times. So as we touch upon tools like Word, Teams, PowerPoint, and Whiteboard, let's see where we can use a tool like generative AI to help streamline some of these processes so our PMs can do more of that value add work, like the cat herding. So after a great brainstorming session, we now need to understand keynotes and action items. I'm in Whiteboard here, and one of my favorite things about Whiteboard is the ability to harness that in-person feeling with things like free writing, sticky notes, pens, highlighters. As we see, it looks like someone's left a comment here. The session's super valuable. It's really organic, but what we don't want to do is spend so long trying to understand what was discussed. I want to go ahead and leverage this session as a launch pad for our next phase. So I hit up Copilot at the bottom there to help me summarize the session. And what it's actually doing is creating a loop component. And if you're not familiar with Loop, it's a fantastic collaborative tool available in the M365 ecosystem. And what it's going to do is it's going to offer a summary of the notes on the board, as well as a screenshot and a link to the board itself. So as we can see here, I've got some great themes, some overarching notes. I can see the screenshot and I can see the link there. So now what I can do, because our project manager quickly has a summary, the notes, I can copy and paste this loop component wherever I might deem necessary, like maybe a Teams channel to initiate some next steps. And because it's now in a loop component, other folks on my team can go in, can add any additional notes that they may need to, can add any clarifying work, propelling us to the next stage of the project. Again, giving space to value add work. So those were some really quick demonstrations of some high value use cases we've seen, not only internally, but across many of the organizations that we've been working with. And again, really wanting to bring Copilot and any generative AI tool into how you work every day to maximize its efficiency. We want to really see generative AI as more than just another tool in our tool belt. When we integrate it in the same ways that we've integrated tools like Teams, Outlook, Word, it becomes second nature, and really then the efficiencies are boundless there. So to kind of bring it back together here, we understand where people are struggling, we've identified some use cases, and now we've seen it in action and how it can be transformative. So when it comes to really making the most of AI in your workplace, it's not just about offering the tool, it's about identifying how we use it over time. So as you implement the tool, ask yourselves, are people in less meetings, and are the meetings shorter? Are there more recaps being generated? Are people spending less time in emails, and are they summarizing their documents? And are they using successful prompts the first time, meaning they're giving Copilot the information they need so that they're not spending as much time refining? And are they editing things less, maybe spending less time in certain applications? All of these statistics can indicate growing success within Copilot. So it's really vital to continue to monitor these questions and metrics. And there are plenty of ways to do that, right? So whether you're using something like the Copilot adoption dashboard, whether you're sending sentiment analysis surveys, which you could leverage, Viva Pulse for to grab that quick feedback, and there's plenty more. We will, of course, go into all of these adoption tools in much more depth in our Enabling Copilot Adoption webinar, but it's still really critical to think of these now when we're thinking about long-term adoption of not just Copilot, but any generative AI tool. And with that, I'll go ahead and pass it back to Tim to take us through what we've covered today.
Yeah, we'll just do a quick little wrap up here just before we take your questions. I see that there are some in the Q&A, and we'll grab them just momentarily. But just wrapping up on what we've covered, Caitlin went over generative AI and how it's built on 100 years of research. And we saw all of the different history of generative AI. We also saw some numbers on employees, how they are overworked and potentially overwhelmed, and why Copilot is a great assistant for that. And then finally, at the end of our session, we talked about Copilot, or we saw Copilot in Word, PowerPoint, and Whiteboard. And then just as Caitlin was mentioning, we saw how important it was to monitor the success of Copilot. So moving forward here, we understand that each organization, and your organization in particular, might be at a different journey or a different place in their AI journey. And that's why we have built this Compass framework that's really developed to meet you where you are at. I'm going to leave this up on the screen for just a moment here, but really from readiness and enablement to extensibility, we've been able to help businesses really of all kinds take the next step in their generative AI journey. So I'll leave this on the screen for just a moment, just so you can kind of take a look at it here. And then, of course, as we finish up just before questions, if you really aren't even sure where to get started, we do offer a free consultation to get to maybe know your organization a little bit better and your needs as well. So you can request that through the link at the bottom of the screen, and we can get started chatting more about your organization and how Copilot can help. So let's go ahead and open it up to questions. I see Rachel jumping back into the screen.
Yep, I'm here. So it looks like we've got a question from Mimi. When creating slides or other content from Copilot, how do you cite your sources since Copilot is pulling from so many?
That's a really great question. One of the things that's so great about Copilot is it often cites its own sources. So typically when you give it a prompt, especially on something like Copilot for the web, it will come back with various sources and links out to where it found that information. So you can confirm for yourself if that's the type of source that you want to be citing. Another thing that you can also do is in your prompting instructions is to simply tell Copilot to cite specific types of reputable sources. So it can then kind of focus on, depending on the task at hand, certain sources over others available on the internet. And then from there, you can copy the link, you can put it in the presentation, and then you've got all the information there for you.
Awesome, thanks. Okay, looks like we've got one from Michael as well. You mentioned generically how organizations are measuring the ROI of Copilot. Do you have more specific examples of how the investment in Copilot is being measured?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a few different ways that we're seeing organizations measure that return or that sort of, business impact. And often it takes multiple avenues to understand that because it's a mixture of hard numbers and sort of softer, the qualitative metrics on how people are feeling at work to be able to reduce burnout and things like that. But to look then at more specific hard numbers, we have organizations who are doing a lot of A/B testing. So they will engage a group of pilot users, identify very specific use cases or tasks that tend to eat up time. So one group in the pilot will be doing those tasks with the addition of Copilot, whereas the other group without the licensing will then be completing those tasks. And, we work with both groups to make sure that we're documenting the exact time spent, sort of billing that time. And then over the course of a few weeks, you can go through and measure the exact amount of time that was spent. And so then you bring into the fold other sort of cost evaluation. So how much does it cost to then license those folks versus how much time was spent over the course of, then their salary. So you can kind of break it down into those sorts of metrics, and it'll really depend on the organization there. Microsoft has also found recently that there's kind of an 11 by 11 tipping point. So over the course of 11 weeks, which is a great time for a pilot, users, as long as they're saving around 11 minutes a day, that equates to essentially like a week of work over a certain, the math is escaping me. Math is not my strong suit. But you hit this point where it's actually not a lot of time in your day that it needs to kind of save or improve to then realize that value over the course of a year. So starting with the pilot, understanding those kind of value metrics, and then moving beyond to how that can apply across the organization has been one of the most impactful ways to measure that ROI.
Awesome. And then I think we've got a question from Ishak, or Ashok, sorry if I'm mispronouncing that. Thank you for your patience. But his question is, what are the prerequisites for enterprises to get ready for Office 365 Copilot? Any checklists or practices to share with the group?
Yeah, I definitely say on a technical side, one, go ahead and come to our information technology and protection webinar coming up next, because that'll go through all of the different aspects of what data needs to be protected. What's nice about Copilot is that it doesn't necessarily inherently bring up or create any security risks. It may put a magnifying glass to any sort of issues that are inherent with your system. So from a technical perspective, just sort of making sure that permissions, security, sort of all data loss protection, sort of data lifecycle management, those are some of the things that we really need to start considering with what Copilot can access. In terms of an organizational cultural perspective, what's really nice is there's not a ton that you necessarily need to do to get up and running. It's just about driving excitement about the tool, understanding its capabilities and its benefits to your users to be able to kind of go through that. But I would definitely say from a technical perspective, our upcoming webinar on information protection is definitely one to attend.
Awesome. And another question from the same attendee, end user interaction data with Copilot, is it stored and for how long? Is there any sensitive data redaction before and after Copilot processes their request?
Yeah, great question. So end user interaction when it comes to the data with Copilot. So kind of 2 points. Your information in your tenant, in your organization is protected by a service boundary. So we do know that none of your information is leaving that service boundary. It's staying safe within there. So that level of protection from the top level is in place. And then when it comes to any sensitive data redaction, that might depend a little bit more on how your own organization is working with tools like Purview to enact sensitivity labels, encryption, things like that. Copilot respects all of those security and permissions. So it's not going to go out and search for sensitive information if you don't already have access to that. It's not kind of a workaround to finding that, as long as those tools and methodologies are in place. And then in terms of how that interaction is stored, for how long, generically, Copilot prompts are retained for like a 90-day history. And that's thinking of graph-grounded chat, but you can get a lot more granular on all of the other types of information and that sort of that retention, depending on your organizational retention policies. So a very open-ended answer, and I'm sorry, but and a little consultancy to say it depends, but we'd have to have a little bit more sort of deep dive into the settings within your organization.
Okay. And then we have a question from Tom. As we see a premium price for Copilot, some CIOs aren't seeing the full value with truly transformational changes. What are some areas organizations can show the time saved is being utilized in higher value work, or would it be purely anecdotal feedback?
So definitely both, and I totally know what you're saying in terms of understanding the sort of transformational changes. We always, again, recommend starting with a pilot to understand on a smaller scale what the potential benefits could be business-wide, because the use cases will vary from department to department. So it's hard to necessarily, it's comparing kind of apples and oranges to look necessarily at the information technology business unit to then maybe like a marketing and communications business unit. So that's where a pilot of users across the board can help identify some of that sort of transformational work. The numbers in terms of the work that needs to be saved or the time sort of reinvested, the numbers sometimes seem small in a way. We talked about 0.7%, right? 4%. But it's when you magnify and multiply those numbers and percentages across a year to understand the cost benefit and sort of the cost takeout, that's really where you start to see some of those larger benefits. But I will say that often the anecdotal feedback helps then drive the sort of hard numbers. So understanding that Copilot is helping our neurodivergent colleagues understand and draft content in a way that helps them throughout their day. Understanding that summarizing long email threads and meetings enables folks to close their computers at 5 o'clock to go have dinner with their family. Those sorts of well-being and anecdotal improvements really marry with the statistics of I saved 15 to 20 minutes on this workflow that I do every single day over the course of a year is 2 weeks of the year, right? Those sorts of things come together like that. So again, a long-winded answer there for you.
Awesome. All right, looks like we've covered every question that's in the chat right now. You guys feel free to throw any last minute questions you have in there. In the meantime, we'll just remind you guys on our next slide here of the upcoming webinars that Caitlin's mentioned and Timothy's mentioned a few times. Please feel free to join us. Lots of questions about data use and data security, so that second webinar there would be helpful. But we really appreciate your attendance. We've got the QR codes here on screen for you, and you can also click that email address there if you have questions or need the link sent to you directly. But you can always reach out to us in addition to these webinars to discuss any of these topics at any time. As you guys can see, we are passionate about Copilot. Would love to talk to you more about your use cases, your specific organizational security concerns. It looks like we've got one more question here. How many organizations have you seen that have moved from POC to production so far, and which vertical or size of the organization?
That's a really great question. So we've actually seen quite a few in a variety. So many of the customers who have now gone into sort of production or a much larger deployment, many of them were part of the early access program with Microsoft. So they started with about 300 licenses. Some of the organizations that we're working with today are deploying between 8 to 10,000 licenses across their organization. And they cover a lot of different verticals, right? So working with many private sector, but talking about telecommunications and manufacturing being some of the main groups that we've been able to work with so far.
Awesome. All right, well, with that, I think we can close out today's session. Again, we invite you guys to join us on the next webinar events and to reach out in the meantime if you have any questions. You'll receive a copy of our on-demand recording and the follow-up emails, as well as a link to the free Copilot consult Timothy mentioned earlier. We appreciate your time and attention and hope to see you again soon. Thank you, Caitlin. Thank you, Timothy.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.